your opening statements to 5 minutes, and then we'll do a round of questions. But Dr. Wilder, if you want to start.
Thank you. Chairman Casey, thank you for this opportunity to present my views on the upcoming elections. I would like to note that these are my views. Ooh. There we go. I'd like to note that the views I expressed today are my own and not necessarily those of the U.S. Institute of Peace, which does not take policy positions. For the past 2 years, the top priority of USIP's Afghanistan program, both in Washington and through our office in Kabul, has been to raise greater awareness of the importance of the 2014 political transition. We have prioritized this because we strongly believe that a credible election that produces a legitimate successor to President Karzai is the best way to promote peace and protect the tremendous achievements of the past decade. I also believe that this is the best way to promote the U.S. objective of a relatively stable Afghanistan that does not slide back into civil war, does not once again become a haven for transnational terrorist groups, and does not destabilize its neighbors, especially Pakistan. In spite of the problems that Afghanistan continues to face, its current constitution has held together a disparate group of political elites. Without legitimate elections next year, the fabric of the constitution will be torn, and with it, the existing consensus on how to allocate power and determine legitimacy. This would be tragic for Afghans, damaging to U.S. interests in the region, and would reinvigorate the Taliban insurgency. I was just in Kabul a few weeks ago, and one of the senior Afghan political figures I spoke with there said to me, if elections are not held, it will be a big propaganda victory for the Taliban, and I think that is the case. Whether we like it or not, the United States plays a major role in the electoral calculations of Afghan political actors. However, there's currently a politically damaging mismatch of perceptions between the signals we think we are sending and the signals that Afghans say they are receiving. There's no question that the United States has been clear in its official statements and bilateral discussions with Afghans about the U.S. desire for credible elections in 2014. Unfortunately, many Afghans continue to question our commitment to their democracy. They note our actions as well as our statements. The recent reports in the media, for example, that some parts of the U.S. government continue to provide President Karzai with unofficial cash payments, is interpreted as a sign that whatever the U.S. says about elections, it in fact remains wedded to supporting the president and his patronage networks. Karzai's very public acknowledgement that he received these funds and the assurance he says he was given that he will continue to receive them clearly show that he recognized the political value within Afghanistan of highlighting this direct U.S. support. In 2009, President Karzai accused the U.S. of undue interference in the electoral process, including favoring certain candidates over others and actively undermining his reelection. Since 2009, the international community has responded by adopting an approach that perhaps has gone too far in the other direction. Afghan politicians regularly complain that the international community's reluctance to push the Afghan government on election-related issues results from a tendency to confuse President Karzai's sovereignty with Afghanistan's sovereignty. As one Afghan put it to me, the United States is interfering in the process as much by staying out of it as it would by being involved. The question is whether its interference is positive or negative for the future of Afghanistan. While Afghan sovereignty must be taken seriously, it is not a violation of this sovereignty for the U.S. and its international partners to highlight, publicly as well as privately, the need for appropriate electoral laws, effective and independent electoral institutions, and robust fraud mitigation measures. To summarize my main recommendations, the first one is that the top priority of U.S. policy in Afghanistan for the next year should be to support credible elections on April 5th next year, which will provide a new leadership team for Afghanistan and preserve the integrity and continuity of the Afghan constitution. The second one is that the U.S. should appoint an official of ambassadorial rank in the embassy in Kabul, specifically tasked with focusing on elections, echoing the recommendation you made in your opening remarks. In addition to helping coordinate the various lines of the U.S. election related support, This would also help to send a clear signal to Afghans that the elections are indeed a top policy priority of the U.S. government. The third recommendation is that in actively supporting the electoral process, the U.S. must avoid the impression that it supports any specific candidate. And number 4, the U.S. should actively support voter education efforts of civil society organizations and the media. Civic education and robust support for an independent media will play a critically important role in mobilizing and educating voters, especially women voters. It will also help generate demand for the elections and promote transparency and accountability. I would like to conclude with a question that an Afghan friend posed to me recently. He said, "We have tried every form of government in the past 100 years in Afghanistan: monarchy, a non-elected presidential republic, anarchy, theocracy, and now democracy. If democracy cannot work, then what is left?" That, I believe, is how many Afghans see the stakes of next year's political transition and why they place so much importance in the elections. And I think that's why we must as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Chayes?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. I think all of us, I can probably speak for all of us, in just expressing appreciation for your initiative with this, because I can say, at least, if the same foresight had been shown in 2009, we might be in a different place today. I'd like to just give you a couple of words to give you a sense of my own perspective. I was asked to discuss a little bit how things went down in 2009, and that's what I'd like, just to provide a context for the types of actions that you might be considering proposing at the moment. At the time, I was a special advisor to the ISAF command. I'd lived in Afghanistan for 7 years, almost all of that time in a regular house in Kandahar, and I speak Pashto, and the people, the people I worked with were ordinary Afghans, men and women from the Kandahar area. And so that experience gave me an intimate insight into how the massive fraud of 2009 was brought about. And what I'm going to describe comes from an unclassified analysis that I provided to the ISAF command, and that was everyone, General McChrystal, General Rodriguez at the time, the Intel and Ops bosses, et cetera. So one of the things we heard today repeated quite often was the issue of Afghanizing the election. I think we need, as Dr. Wilder suggested, we need to think carefully about what we mean by that. What I found was that the fraud operation was incredibly sophisticated, and it began with what I could call a PSYOPs campaign, a psychological operations campaign against us by Karzai and the key ministers, and by that I mean the Minister of Defense, the Minister of the Interior, the key IDLG, the independent, Directorate of Local Governance, sorry. And that was a main point they were all trying to impress on us, is we need to Afghanize this election. And I have to say the international community jumped on board with that concept, in particular the United Nations, which saw this as a mark of success, the degree to which we backed out of, we the international community, backed out of involvement in again, the process. It's not about pick and winners. It's about oversight over the process. ISAF, I have to say, was delighted to be relegated to third rank security, so not even eyes on to polling stations. The effect was, these were concepts that we really were sensitive to. We didn't want to impinge on Afghan sovereignty, but that was a very effective way for the Karzai machine, more or less, to protect itself from observation. In fact, the Afghan government was not neutral. It had been set up to pursue the objective of re-electing President Karzai, and that's how every Afghan citizen that I interacted with, and that was a lot, saw it. And they saw at the time the international community as the sole potential guarantors of the independence of the process. And again, I can remember the night before the election getting a call from a town on the border with Pakistan. They've started stuffing the ballot boxes already. It's at so-and-so's house on such and such a street. And the implied plea there was send somebody, make it stop, you know. And so there was a real disconnect between our sense of we need to respect Afghan sovereignty and the Afghan population's sense that we were respecting, as Dr. Wilder put it, Karzai's sovereignty and not their sovereignty. The other really important sort of psychological operations effort was to reduce the number of so-called black districts. So there were a lot of districts that were considered too insecure to open polling stations. And there was huge pressure put on the ISAF management to do whatever it could to reduce the number of black districts. And the notion that was handed to us was most of those were in Pashtun areas, and Pashtuns want to vote for Karzai, so Karzai's voters will have been disenfranchised, and therefore he could contest the election. That begs the question whether Pashtuns were in fact supportive of President Karzai. But two things happened, a couple of things happened. One was there were elections operations, which ISAF did not want to conduct at the time. They wanted, the doctrine at the time was you don't do an operation where you don't plan to stay. But the pressure from the Afghan government was such that ISAF decided to do these clearing operations just for the purposes of the election. The second thing that happened that was really interesting was deals with the Taliban. And these were briefed to us by the director of the National Security Directorate. And it was offering de facto recognition by entering into deals with them. It was sanctuary within their districts because in a number of these cases, ANSF were agreed not to go in. You had money. And again, when we're talking about cash being handed over to Afghan government officials, the question arises, what is that cash being used for? Well, one of the purposes was paying off Taliban so that they would do what? Allow people to vote? No. What they had to do was allow voting materials to enter and then return from the district. Now, nobody voted in these districts, and I knew people in a lot of them, and I checked this. So why didn't Karzai complain about his voters being disenfranchised? The objective was to obtain empty ballot boxes that were official ballot boxes, but empty, emanating from districts that were believed to be supportive of President Karzai, and that's where most of the ballot box stuffing happened. Then you had small, weak, under-resourced oversight bodies. As you mentioned, we've got vetoes on the ECC and the IEC structures. Right now, not only vetoes, we've got Karzai saying there should be no ECC. The ECC, in fact, should be the Attorney General, who, again, I know from having followed anti-corruption very, very closely, this is a guy who answers, who does what Karzai picks up the phone to him and tells him what to do. And the IEC, currently, Karzai is standing up for being able to simply appoint all the members of the IEC. I mean, you couldn't imagine two bodies that are less independent than that. And so, again, I find the sort of wishes that were expressed by the earlier panelists a bit, there's a delta between what they were saying and what the likely realities are. Those were the conditions at a time when US involvement in Afghanistan was the highest it ever has been in the past 13 years. So I just leave you to imagine what the level of involvement in the process that would be required from the United States in order to bring about something that was better than 2009. The upshot at that time was that the Afghan population felt unbelievably betrayed by us because they trusted us to bring about a credible process. Surprisingly to me, I'm finding that my Afghan friends are very excited about the upcoming election. I just think we need to be very careful. While I agree that we need to message how important this event is, we also have to be careful that if we say we consider it to be important, then we need to think through what are the concrete steps that we're going to take.
We're gonna have to
Already
move.
over, yep. All right, I'll stop there, and then if you have further questions, we can go.
We'll have some
Yeah,
time.
thanks a lot.
Mr. Boot, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me, and congratulations to you and the rest of the committee on the passage of what I hope will be a very important resolution on Syria earlier in the day. I just returned a few weeks ago from my latest trip to Afghanistan, where I've been traveling regularly since 2008 at the invitation of our military commanders to assess the situation. And on this trip, I saw much cause for confidence in Afghanistan's future, as well as considerable cause for concern. The factors that are positive really relate to the security situation in the southern part of the country, which was obviously the focus of ISAF and Afghan operations in the last few years. And there's also pretty decent security, I would say, in the west and the north, as well as in Kabul, and in most of those areas, not through anything that we've done, but simply because there are not a lot of Pashtuns there, and it's largely a Pashtun-based insurgency. But there was considerable cause for concern for reasons that Senator McCain alluded to earlier, having to do with the continued existence of Pakistan's role as an enabler of the insurgency, the lack of security, especially in eastern Afghanistan, including provinces like Logar and Wardak, which are on the very doorstep of Kabul itself, and of course the corruption, which continues to cripple the ability of the government to gain the confidence of its own people. I think at this point, if I had to prognosticate about the outcome in Afghanistan, I think I would have to say it's very evenly balanced, maybe 55-45, maybe 51-49. I think the odds are still in favor of a positive outcome, but only barely so. And I think a lot of it will depend on crucial factors, some of which are not entirely in our control. What I'd like to talk about in the few minutes that I have here today is 4 recommendations for action, one of them focusing on the presidential election, in which I will differ from some of what you've heard earlier in the day. But let me just, before I get to the election, let me just mention 3 other things that I think need to happen for a successful outcome in Afghanistan. First, I think we need to continue providing at least $5 billion a year indefinitely to support the Afghan security forces. If we cut down to the $4 billion goal, which was reached in the Chicago NATO summit, the result would be to lay off something like 120,000 soldiers and police at the very same time that we're pulling out most of the international security forces. That would be a disaster and would be an invitation to a Taliban victory. So I think we need to keep funding the NSF at least the level of $5 billion a year. We need to have a substantial advise and assist force there after 2014. At a minimum, I would say the level of 13,600 recommended by General Mattis, although I would be more comfortable with the level of 20 to 30,000. The third point that I would make is that we need to have a substantial campaign to counter the malign influence of Pakistan and the ISI, modeled, I would argue, on the campaign we waged in Iraq in 2007, 2008 to counter the influence of the Iranian Quds Force, using all of our covert and overt capabilities to identify and target Quds Force operatives for capture or deportation, or at the very least to publicize their activities and discredit what they were doing. I think we need a similar campaign in Afghanistan. We need to get over the illusion that Pakistan is our friend. They are not. They are actively supporting our enemies, and we need to recognize that and act accordingly. The fourth and final point that I would make is in regard to the elections. And here I differ a little bit, Mr. Chairman, from what you said earlier and what from some of the other witnesses, especially from the official administration witnesses, have said, because I do believe that we have no choice but to pick winners and losers in this election. And effectively, we'll do that, as Dr. Wilder suggested. Even if we take a hands-off attitude, we're effectively picking winners and losers, because if we take a completely hands-off attitude at this point, we will be seen as endorsing Karzai and whoever his hand-picked candidate is to succeed him, because that's the effect of these bags of cash that the CIA is delivering to him. I'm not averse to the idea of the CIA exerting its influence through the use of money. That's something we've done in the past successfully, for example, in the early years of the Cold War in places like Europe, resisting the attempts of communists to take power at the ballot box. I think that's a legitimate thing to do. My concern is that this, from what I understand, and of course these are all highly classified programs that I'm not read into, but certainly from the public reporting which has occurred, my sense is that what the CIA does is very short-term oriented, really designed to grease the way for their strike forces, their ability to continue counterterrorism operations and to enhance their limited influence. My sense is they are not really taking a long-term view of the country's future, and they're not really using their clout to enhance the long-term prosperity and stability and security of Afghanistan, which I think should be our goal. I mean, we can take what I believe to be a self-defeating attitude of saying, well, all we care about is the sanctity of the electoral process. But the reality is, first off, I have very little confidence in the sanctity of the electoral process in Afghanistan, especially when it's going to happen after we've withdrawn most of our troops from that country. The ANSF I don't think is going to be interested in guaranteeing the sanctity of the outcome. They're going to be working for whoever gives them the orders to do so. So, you know, the notion that there is going to be some pure electoral process, I think, is a myth. What's really going to happen is that and what's happening right now in Kabul is that the power brokers and outside players, like the Iranians and Pakistanis or others, are politicking to determine who will be the next leader of Afghanistan. I would hope that we would be actively casting our vote because we have a large vote in that. I think we mishandled the last process in 2009 in part because we were so diffident about exerting our influence, and the result of that was we gave Karzai the impression that we were opposing him without doing anything effective to oppose him. So we got the worst of both worlds. We got the leader we didn't want, and he was annoyed at us for seeming to try to block his way. But in this instance, I think we need to make clear that we will not allow Karzai to abuse the process to entrench himself or his relatives in power. This ought to be a red line, and we should make clear we will not give Afghanistan a dime if the election is not held and if Karzai somehow maneuvers to keep himself in power through extra-constitutional means. But beyond that, I think the succession race right now is wide open. There are many candidates. There's no clear front runner. I think we have a tremendous opportunity to try to figure out who is going to be the strongest and least corrupt candidate, the one who's most likely to unite Afghanistan and to move it forward. And I think that is a determination we need to make. We should not announce it, obviously, but it's a determination that the ambassador and station chief should be making, and we should be doing what we can behind the scenes to aid whoever we think is going to be the strongest candidate, or, put another way, the least bad candidate. I'm sorry, that doesn't comport with Civics 101, but I think that is the reality of Afghanistan, and we need to do that to protect the monumental investment in blood and treasure that we have made in that country, and to prevent a criminal clique from stealing the election, which otherwise I think is the likely outcome.
Mr. Booth, thank you very much. What I'm hearing from a lot of the members, or several of the members of this panel, is we better have our eyes wide open. That the reality of an election isn't always what's in the civics books. You're right, and that's why we have these hearings where we have not just two panels, but I think two different, in some ways, two different vantage points. Let me go back to this question of either the reality of interference or the perception thereof. Dr. Wilder, you've talked a little bit about this. Mr. Booth, there seems to be some conflict here. What's your reaction to, or your comment on that interference question, and especially in light of what Mr. Booth said? We try not to create arguments within the panel, but sometimes it's helpful and illuminating.
Yeah, I think it is helpful to go back to 2009 and look at that, because I often think that the wrong lessons have been learned from 2009. I mean, and I think one of those is I would disagree in the sense that I think trying to pick favorites, I think it is not something we should be doing, as I mentioned in my testimony, for a number of reasons. One is we don't actually have a track record that's terribly good in getting that right. I think we only have to go back to November 2001 at a conference in Bonn where we actually played a pretty instrumental role in picking a winner. And now I think we don't feel that went according to plan, but I think there has been a track record of actively backing, President Karzai in the past as our candidate, our man. I have actually a lot more confidence in the Afghan voters in terms of picking their next leader than in our ability to handpick the right successor. Because I think it's really critical that whoever comes in next is perceived as legitimate. And I think that the more it's perceived that it's our fingers on it trying to determine who that will be, the risks are that whoever ends up in that position will be perceived as less legitimate. And so the lesson for me from 2009 is don't interfere in terms of picking favorites, but do interfere in terms of trying to ensure that this election is going to be held on as level a playing field as possible. Do interfere in terms of trying to ensure, again, much more rigorous fraud mitigation measures for this election. Trying to put pressure on in terms of the electoral laws, but in particular, signaling that the elections are the U.S. #1 foreign policy priority in Afghanistan for this coming year, because we do believe that the security transition and the economic transition cannot succeed without the successful political transition. And I think if we can give more confidence to the Afghans that the U.S. is behind these elections, we'll see more Afghans stepping up to the plate to actually start contesting them, because that's the damaging situation we currently have in Afghanistan. Every night in Kabul, the political elite are meeting and wheeling and dealing, and electoral politics is happening, and I think that's actually one of the most encouraging things about what's happening in Afghanistan today. Many of these elites have done fabulously well in the last decade and have a lot of vested interest in making sure that the country doesn't fall apart. So I think are trying to actively look at ways to create consensus-building efforts, create coalitions to contest the next election. But some of them are holding back because they are concerned, will there be election? Why put your life on the line or put your resources on the line to contest an election that likely won't happen? I think that's where there's not confidence that President Karzai his #1 objective is to hold elections, and I think that's where we need to be continuing ourselves to make strong statements that this is our priority. I think that will give incentives to the Afghan candidates. And I don't like to use the word opposition, because we are going to an election where President Karzai is, by the Constitution, not allowed to contest. We need to look at all the candidates on an equal basis, not government versus opposition. So again, don't support individuals, but do interfere in supporting the process. Thank you.
And I want to continue this line of discussion, but I have to say, for the record, probably a lot of members of Congress over the last couple of years have been pretty critical of Mr. Karzai. I'm one of them. In fact, for a couple of years, I was probably one of the leading critics. So, and that's on the public record. I'm sure he doesn't recall that, but I was. But I did, in the last time I saw him first time I met him was 2008, then 2009, within a day or two of the election. And I and others pressed him on making sure that now that the election had taken place, that they take steps to meet the legitimate expectations of the people, and of course he assured us he would. I didn't have a chance to see him when I went back in 2011, but I did see him earlier this year when he came to visit, just a brief visit on Capitol Hill, and we were actually in Senator McConnell's office, and it was just a small group of us. But I said that to him. I said, I've criticized you a lot in the past, and I'm going to try to refrain from that today and say that you should use this opportunity to make sure that you have an election, it goes well, and that'll be your legacy and not something else. Of course, he I guess somewhat agreed with that, but then seemed to be critical of us in not interfering in a process that he doesn't seem to conduct very well. But anyway, let me get back to the question of interference. I think, Ms. Chayes, I know you've raised a lot of concerns about what happened last time in your testimony and how we prepare for this. What's your view on this question of interference? I think it's an interesting idea that a really tough, aggressive imposition or us having an impact on the rules and how the election is conducted could be seen as interference, but might be the most constructive way that we have an impact apart from or separated from the question of picking a candidate. Maybe that's an area where we can agree that if we institute or push them to institute as rigorous a process as possible, that might be the best. What's your view on what you've heard from your two colleagues here and how you view it?
I would probably concur with what you just said and what Dr. Wilder said. I guess I just have to, again, try to impress on you and on the record what rigorous would have to mean. So, again, you just raised the issue of the vetoes by President Karzai of the IEC and ECC structures. What do we do? How do we participate in making this a credible and free and fair exercise if the two bodies charged with running it belong to President Karzai? Honestly, I mean, we're really in a bind because on the one hand, we're saying there has to be an election, it has to be Afghan-managed, Afghan-led. And on the other hand, if Afghan-managed, Afghan-led means Karzai-managed, Karzai-led, do we fund the exercise anyway? If we decide not to fund it, Karzai's thrilled, great, no election. So I have to say I don't have a great answer to that question, but I don't think picking the guy, fundamentally because we don't have a great track record, is probably the right solution. On the other hand, continuing to pay one of them. So one of the things I think is really important if we care how things work out in Afghanistan is arbitrating between the different USG equities that are at play here. Because if we are paying President Karzai, it doesn't matter what you say to him or what any other member of the US government says to him, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Secretary of State, up to the president. Once he's getting money from the Central Intelligence Agency, that strengthens him to do whatever he wants in spite of anything that any other member of the US government, with the exception of the president, could say. So I think that's a really important issue to think about is if he or somebody chosen by him is a candidate, I mean, he won't be, but if there's some Karzai proxy who's a candidate, which I think is really likely, is that person on the payroll? Does that get debated at, a principals committee meeting? So it's one thing to say we shouldn't pick an, quote, opposition candidate, but therefore we need to really be clear about where is our private bags of cash, where are they going? I think another really important aspect of this that hasn't been brought up, but has to do with the security, which is to say, and I did bring it up at ISAF in 2009, are we construing our mandate to protect the security of these elections as a mandate to protect it from intimidation from the government as well as intimidation from the Taliban? That, that was not a question that got a very coherent answer. I think that's a really important issue to think about this time, is if we're really about protecting the integrity of the process, that means we have to be just as rigorous about violations of that integrity, physical violations, that are caused by non-Taliban as well as ones that are caused by Taliban.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Boot, if I keep giving the last word, that's an advantage to you, but I'll... What's your sense of the, well, let me just ask it more precisely because you've addressed it, but is the question of interference perceived or in reality, I guess you'd say that's not a great concern for you. But would you, I guess what would you place greater reliance on or place greater weight on? Actually getting involved in picking a candidate, as you seem to hint at, or being much more focused on the rules and imposing a free and fair election as best we can, what do you think is the preferable path?
Well, in terms of avoiding the perception of interference in Afghan elections, as my colleagues and Sarah in particular have pointed out, we're interfering right now, and Afghans know that. I mean, they know we're giving bags of cash to Karzai, so it doesn't really matter what we do. We're going to be seen as interfering. At the moment, we seem to be interfering to buttress a president who is deeply enmeshed in this corruption and dysfunctionality that grips his country. All I'm saying is, instead of taking a completely hands-off attitude, let's interfere or try to interfere in a more positive direction. And I don't think that's impossible. I mean, it's true that we made a mistake in hindsight, I think, in picking Karzai at the end of 2001, and it's quite possible we might make another mistake in the future, but at least I would draw some solace from the fact that at the end of 2001, we knew very little about Afghan politics. At least we've had a dozen years since then to hopefully, and I'm not sure it's happened, but hopefully have a little bit of a learning process within the USG and at least a little more familiarity with who the players are, what they stand for, and the intricacies of Afghan politics. So I think there's a slightly better chance that we might get it right this time than we did last time. And it's not, I would, as a historian, I would point you to a historical example, which was the way that we defeated the Huk Rebellion, the communist uprising in the Philippines in the late 40s, early 50s. The most important thing we did was to send one man to the Philippines, Edward Lansdale, who was a CIA operative as well as a CIA operative as well as an Air Force officer. And the most important thing he did was to befriend a gentleman named Ramon Magsaysay, who was just a Filipino state senator when they met, but with Lansdale's support and the support of the CIA, they managed to get Magsaysay promoted first to defense minister, and then Lansdale was virtually his campaign manager to help him win the presidency of the Philippines. And Magsaysay, it was the best thing that ever happened to the Philippines because he was honest, he was strong, he fought corruption and abuse in the army, and he managed by those methods to defeat the Huk uprising. That's an example that I think we need to be cognizant of. In the case of Afghanistan, certainly I'm not by any means saying we should give up on the election. I agree with my colleagues. We need to do everything possible to have a free and fair election. I think I'm just being, and I hope I'm not being overly cynical here by suggesting it's not likely to happen. I mean, if it didn't happen, in Chicago in the old days, it's not going to happen in Afghanistan today. I think especially when our troop presence is going to be so markedly reduced. But just as in this country, we have free and fair elections, but let's be honest, there's a primary process that happens even before anybody casts a vote. Mm-hmm. In the last election, I think people generally knew that Mitt Romney was going to be the Republican candidate well in advance of the first primaries or caucuses because he had in effect won this pre-primary for the backing of donors and other power brokers within the Republican Party. The exact same thing is happening in Afghanistan right now. And certainly Karzai and the ISI and the Iranians and others, they're casting their votes. And the question is, are their votes going to be decisive? Or are we going to do something to try to counterbalance their vote by trying to push forward a leader who will truly not be an American puppet, that's not what I'm looking for, and a strong leader who will truly have the interests of Afghanistan at heart. And that leader may well do things that exasperate us in the way that de Gaulle did, for example, in France, but nevertheless somebody who would not be a catspaw of the ISI or the Iranians or the warlords. I think that's what Afghanistan needs. And I think in many ways the only chance that the political process has to produce somebody like that is with a little outside assistance from us.
Well, and I'm reminded that in this country it took most of 100 years before a lot of states got the secret ballot, so it took us a while. I know we have to wrap up, but I guess in more of a kind of a lightning round, if you could just outline the 2 or 3 steps, you might have 4 or 5, but if you could prioritize 1 or 2 steps that we should take in the next really in the next several months or the next 6 months to get the result that we hope for, which is a free and fair election. We'll set aside the question of who wins or what's the optimal, but to get as free and as fair an election as possible. Any quick summary of 1 or 2 steps that we should take?
Again, I would come back to the point that, again, how do we make this clear that this is, for the next year, the #1 U.S. government priority? And I think that's where the appointment of an ambassador rank official in that role would be one way of signaling that. But then also following up with frequent high-level statements of their importance to the U.S. government. Because as I said, this is where there is this mismatch. We do often say that they're a priority and we say the right things about them, but Afghans, again, I still need to hear it more often. And just in the last 2 trips I made to Afghanistan in March and April, it was striking to me how many Afghan politicos referenced then Senator Kerry's confirmation hearings in front of this committee, where he very clearly spoke about the importance of the elections as a priority issue. And I think that created a very positive vibes in Kabul and gave a little encouragement to those who do believe in the elections. And just last week ago here at USIP, we hosted a fairly prominent Afghan opposition figure, and one of his key points was, in terms of the priorities of the election, is fight the doubt. Because it is easy to think of all the reasons why elections won't be possible in Afghanistan. And if we really give in to that, too much skepticism will become self-fulfilling. We have to believe they can happen and then prepare for that with, again, the measures I mentioned. And I think that then Afghans will then take the lead to make sure that they do indeed happen. But the final point to emphasize in that regard is I think there's a supply side to this, but the demand side we need to focus on with early support to the civic education piece. The media piece plays an incredibly important role. The Afghan public need to also feel that the elections are going to be happening, and we need to work on that demand side. And too often, civic education is left as an afterthought to just before the election. We need to be investing and supporting those efforts earlier than in past elections. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Chayes?
I'm going to change the aperture a little bit. I tend to agree with Mr. Boot that it's very unlikely that we will supply what it takes to actually make this exercise truly free and fair and credible. I actually think there's something quite different we could do that could help set the conditions, which would have to do with expanding the scope of the reconciliation process. I think we've been stuck in a rut, which has been speaking to just one interlocutor, or trying to speak, we haven't even been speaking to one interlocutor, which is to say the armed opposition. But it turns out that most Afghan constituencies have severe issues with the Karzai government and with the way the Afghan government has been executing its duties or not since 2001. I think this reconciliation process needs urgently, and it ought to be US government policy urgently, to expand this reconciliation process to include those constituencies. I would give the current Afghan government a seat, but not a gavel. And I would not give Pakistan a seat, because and that's a whole other issue, but that has the impact of rewarding the deliberate use of violent extremists as an instrument of public policy on the part of Pakistan. But if you get a process like that going, and there have been a couple of experiments of late in France, in Japan, but in particular in France over the last few months or last 6 months or so, that indicate that this is a doable process. We have not been interested. President Karzai has extremely not been interested. And again, it has to do with a little bit of political will on our part to force a dialogue or a conversation, a multipolar conversation. And I think a process like that could start to work out what a lot of the equities are, so that an election at the far end of it, there would be less incentive to try to rig an election at the other end of it. Thank you very much, and thanks again for your interest.
Thank you. Mr. Booth?
Mr. Chairman, I think there is a crisis of confidence in Afghanistan right now. At least that's what I saw and heard about when I was there a few weeks ago. Property prices are falling. The amount of money exiting the country is increasing. Afghans don't have a lot of confidence in their post-2014 future. I think the most important thing we can do right now, as early as possible, is to signal what our level of commitment post-2014 is going to be. I think that will increase confidence. It will also boost our influence and our ability to try to influence the future of Afghanistan in a positive direction. Whether you think all we should be doing is is trying to protect the integrity of the balloting process, or whether you believe, as I do, that I think we need to take a more robust role. Whatever that role is, I think we will enhance our influence by signaling that what our level of commitment will be, because up until now we've said we will stay committed, but there's a big difference between levels of commitment. And the higher the level of commitment that we express, the more confidence that the government and supporters of the government will have, and the more we will demoralize and weaken the Taliban. So I think that's the most immediate thing that we can do to affect the calculus in Afghanistan. I mean, the other things that I would, again, not just stress that I mentioned in my opening statement, I think we need to do much more to counter ISI influence. And as we were discussing earlier, I also believe that we need to play a more robust role in helping to select a strong leader for Afghanistan. But the first thing, I think, is just a signal that we will have a robust commitment post-2014. And I thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to testify with two leading experts, and I'm glad you're interested, because I think one of the biggest problems we face right now, quite frankly, is there's not a lot of interest in the future of Afghanistan in this country. So I'm glad you're staying focused on it. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thanks to all of our witnesses, and the record will be open for questions for what, 5 days, I guess? I think it's 5 days. We'll correct the record if it isn't. And I also wanted to mention that I didn't at the beginning, that the resolution that Senator McCain and I introduced was co-sponsored by Chairman Menendez, so that's good news. But we're done for today, but I'm sure we'll be able to call upon each of you for further insight as we get closer to this election day, which I realize has a lot of problems connected to it, so we've got more work to do. But thanks very much. We're adjourned.